So the name inhibits the bio growth of bacteria, and it does that for a few weeks.
Yes.
And then, so at the grain level, so you have that little grain of urea coated, and it falls onto the ground, and the bacteria then either say, oh, I can't eat it, or they get killed, whatever, something happens there. But then the little coating washes off or something.
Well, yeah, because again, it's made out of plant properties, so
something decomposes it.
It just it's like it breaks down into its like chemical compounds.
So you're just delaying it by 3 weeks, the whole process. So why would then the nitrogen use efficiency increase?
Well, so I have most like all amplification inhibitors, it seems to suggest that it just delays that nitrogen, and because of that, maybe the plant has better able to use it. Because normally farmers will apply urea right at the start when they, right after they sow at a plant. So potentially what it's doing is just delaying that nitrogen for when plants can actually take it up.
Okay, so it's a delay.
Well,
I'm sure Phil has a answer to that. But the second question is, and I didn't understand the story about the methane. So you say if it's not nitrified, and I understand it's not, or it's delayed, then the nitrification is delayed. Do you then have more methane emission? Is that what you said?
Well, so a lot of studies have noticed that, methane production seems to release, but not too many people are talking about why that is. So this is still just a hypothesis. There's not too many studies that have looked at if this is actually happening. But what their hypothesis is that the urea breaks down, like you have ammonium that's going to be left, and it's not going to break down into nitrate because of the bacteria dead. So what that ammonium does is it increases the population growth of methanotrophs, which is the bacteria that will break down methane into, will oxidize methane into carbon dioxide. So what you have is, instead of that methane that would normally, the organic methane that would just, like, producers would produce methane and it would be released into the atmosphere. And now what you have is population growth, so that methane is being broken down into CO2, and you have decreased methane emissions from those systems.
Yeah, I understand it, but I don't understand whether it's going to increase or not.
Well, it's going to decrease that methane. It'll decrease the methane emissions, because methane is going to now be oxidized into carbon dioxide that would previously be released into the atmosphere as emissions.
I had a third question. Someone else first.
Okay.
I have a question about farm size and what the landscape looks like. I know it's mostly arable, but are these mostly smallholder farmers, and what kind of access do they have to these types of fertilizers, and what other fertilizers are being used?
So you have mostly smallholder farmers, about a hectare or around that, 1.5 hectares. So definitely not large. One of the things the government has been trying to do is get fertilizers to everybody, and as far as I can tell from a lot of the articles, that seems to be working. And whether that's on the ground, I can't obviously tell for sure, but systems are in place to make sure that farmers get those urea fertilizers at a reduced price. And obviously there's still corruption within the system, as explained by producers now selling that fertilizer that should have gone to farmers to industry. But farmers do seem to be getting that urea if there's seen by just the evidence of how yields are going, and that fertilizer use in India seems to be going up. So definitely seems to be going to them.
And is urea the only nitrogen source?
For urea, yeah, pretty much it's 82% of nitrogen is coming from urea. You have monoammonium phosphate, which is the main phosphate fertilizer. And then there are a few other combinations. I think ammonium nitrate is there a little, and then mixtures of those compounds, of nitrogen compounds, but urea is pretty much the primary one.
Is there a reason why we don't use this new coated here in the United States?
Well, I can't tell for sure. I mean, I do know that there are U.S. companies that sell it as a bioinsecticide, and yeah, there are like 2 or 3 that use them as an organic bioinsecticide. but I haven't seen it being used as a fertilizer in US at least. And honestly, compared to some of the other nitrification inhibitors, this doesn't maybe do as well as compared to, say, the DCD or the thiosulfate. However, for Indian farmers, again, they're small holders, and urea plus DCD tends to be far more expensive. So for a smallholder farmer, buying something like DCD is going to be hard when urea itself needs to be subsidized. So for India, at least, or maybe for other smaller countries, neem works because the price of manufacturing goes up by about $5 to $10, so not a great deal overall, and it still remains perfectly affordable for farmers. So that impact, so it could have a significant impact on them, even if it's not perhaps as big of a difference as DCD.
We had a professor called Larry Bundy. His long-term study showed that using normal fertilizer, not inhibited, in Midwest we lost something like 50%. So in India, without using these things, just under normal condition, how many percent fertilizer applied is being lost to the environment?
I think it differs by system. I know with rice, it's actually about 50% or maybe even less, but wheat, I think, loses a lot of that nitrogen, and I think it was closer to 60, 70%. 60%, maybe not 70, so.
With neem.
Oh, with neem, how much of that nitrogen is being released? I don't have numbers. It seems to suggest that there is a nitrification inhibition, but how that translates to nitrogen use efficiency, it's been seen on smaller systems, and some of the smaller like field farms show that it has improved nitrogen recovery, but not enough studies that I could have actually made a conclusion on it. Yeah.
Small question on the type of soil. So most of it was alpha salts, I think you said?
Yeah. So most of India is alpha salts, but actually a lot of the studies have been done on inceptisols, just because where the studies are being doing, which are mostly in Delhi, it's the predominant soil type.
Right. So now, if you were to apply the predictions from the experiments done in, say, New Delhi, are they producing the same results or similar results, or is it different just because of soil?
So
type or
actually, I
texture?
haven't, none of the studies that I've looked at have used alpha salts, surprisingly. They have used inceptisols, ultasols, and vertisols, and all the results were comparable. Like they were all pretty similar. But in terms of being used elsewhere, most of the studies were being done on field research farms, so stuff like Arlington Research Center. So how that would translate into a farmer's field is something that I haven't seen. But I don't think soil type would affect that much if what these studies seem to suggest is true.
And you just brought up another one. So when we do research, say at Arlington, we strive for pristine, perfect conditions. Like we know exactly what's going on.
Right.
But like if you're applying on say a family farm that might not have that such stringent regulations, and they're not like measuring everything perfectly, were there experiments to, I guess, test it on somebody's average everyday farm?
No. And so I guess that's something that could be a broader question on Indian research and extension, but participatory research, isn't as big in India as it is starting to get in the United States. And so if there are studies, they're not being, maybe some of the research stations are doing these studies, but they're not publishing those results or that I could find. So yeah, all of these are in field stations and labs.
Could you go back to slide 20, I think? The slide where the studies are listed and then the effectiveness of neem. Yeah, so just kind of trying to come together with the differences in results. So
yeah,
I think in the next slides we looked at length of time for the studies, right? What else? We see the concentration of the extract.
Right.
I guess, so kind of the same question that I have, maybe two-part, is what are the funding sources of those studies? And then also for the field studies where it's so much lower, I think we saw one slide where you did insert the rainfall or the irrigation amount, but was that amount of water accounted for? I'm just kind of thinking about if leaching was a problem.
So none of the studies actually compare leaching. Again, all these are field stations. So one of the studies I looked at was looking at more of a sandy loam soil as compared to clay loam. And they suggested that leaching losses were not having a significant effect on their studies, but that was the only study that significantly actually mentioned leaching. So
I guess I shouldn't have maybe said leaching, but just the movement of it. and
just
it-
the movement of
Yeah,
it.
I was thinking in 2013 I used neem oil in my garden as a foliar spray, but every time it rained I'd have to try to reapply, so it wasn't so effective. So I wondered if this had the ability to stick around given rainfall or irrigation.
Right. So a lot of this is the urea. It's sprayed onto the urea coating. So by that time, it's in the soil. From what I can tell, yes, rainfall. Like there was, I think, in the graph that was probably. Never mind. The graph that I was looking at actually does show that where there is rainfall, there was a slight increase, but aha, got it. Yeah. So yeah, you do see that when there is irrigation, there is an increase in the emissions. So, but it does seem to be sticking around because you still see those effects after that irrigation, and you also see it later, if not in the neem, at least in the other NIs. So, as a coating, it seems to be sticking around for long enough, even after like rainfall or irrigation events. And that may be because again, as a coating and it's going into the soil as opposed to being sprayed.
And then did you look at the funding sources?
Oh, sorry, funding sources. Most of the funding sources are actually the Indian Center for Agricultural Research. And then there are a few more sources. Again, most of them are all government. Actually, all of them are government, Indian government sources. And so a few other research stations. There's a couple of soil and crop research stations in Gujarat and stuff. So they were the ones looking at these studies. Yeah.
So Kavya, you're going to have a degree in soil science.
Yes.
And you showed us these roaring videos at the beginning saying how wonderful this is. And
Yeah.
good for your groundwater. And what else did they claim? They claim a lot of.
Good for crops and increasing yield, purifying groundwater and killing pests.
So very, very roaring. And then you showed us a bit of literature.
Yeah.
So suppose you were to advise the Indian government whether it makes sense to put that name on it or not. What would you do? Would you say, well, folks, really, you know, we've an inhibition of 2 to 12%. Really?
Well, well, if I were
Based on all the
recommending
evidence
it,
or the lack of evidence that you presented here.
like I was saying earlier, the main incentive for the government to add neem-coated urea was actually an industrial divergence of that urea. So
Right.
for them, it was more the economics than any of the scientific research. And I guess if I were giving a recommendation, I would say it hasn't shown any negative impacts. So while it's showing pretty large nitrification inhibition in labs, incubations,
Right.
maybe not as much in the fields, but it's never shown a decrease or like an increase in nitrate concentrations. It's never shown a decrease in yield. So we're not really seeing any negative impacts. And compared to some of the other slow release or nitrification inhibitors, which are way too expensive for farmers, this is something that's being used in India for a while. And farmers have used it even before like there was any scientific research looking at it, just through observation. They were using it as perhaps a fertilizer. So I would say if it is helping out economically as well, like obviously we should still be researching to see if we can make it better. And there are definitely some of the more concentrated extracts that seem to have a better, like even in this study, the Nimin coated, which is over here, it does show a significant decrease in emissions. And overall I've seen in research that it does do better than neem. So maybe looking at a way to commercially produce that and studying the effects of Nimin more.
Can I contextualize that a little bit?
Yeah.
Governments have denatured alcohol, for example, ethanol, on purpose to keep it from being diverted into the human beverage and so it's a higher cost for the ethanol when it's intended for human beverages. When it's intended for fuel or truly medicinal uses, it's either mixed with ethanol or gasoline or things like that,
Right.
that are difficult to remove from the product, so it can't go into these other industries for human consumption.
Right.
And it's purely a matter of government and government policy for
Right.
issues of
No.
subsidizing transportation with ethanol or something. So this would appear to be another one of those.
Yeah.
So what's this do to the fertilizer companies? Are these government fertilizer companies that are making it, or?
No, so I think the government does own a few fertilizer companies, but most of these are all private. So the first ad that I showed was actually a private fertilizer company, Jumbo. So
they're being obliged by the government to make it this way, and the importers are obliged, well, there's probably no import of urea if they're making it locally and subsidized.
So there is actually a bit of import right in the beginning. There is if you look at the graph, there's a difference in the blue line is the production, India's urea production, and the brownish line is the consumption. So there is a gap, and that gap has actually been increasing. And the government's been pushing for all imports to also be neem-coated urea. Well, how well that works, I don't know. But yes, all urea production in India is neem-coated. And so private companies don't have to produce the neem-coated urea, but they can get a subsidy for it without it being neem-coated urea. So you do have fertilizer companies that make just urea, or also other more expensive urea, like the Nimin-coated and sulfur-coated urea, and other more conventional nitrification inhibitors, but those aren't being subsidized by the government. Okay.
And do you
Yeah.
happen to know what the current recommendations